Good morning. Thank you for joining us. We're going to give folks just 1 or 2 minutes here to go ahead and roll in, but we appreciate you all taking some time to talk with us this morning about composting and jumping worms. So we're just going to allow 1 or 2 minutes here to make sure everyone can join us. Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Good morning, everybody. My name is Tim Farnan. I work with the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency and serve on the board of directors for the Minnesota Composting Council. Today, we're here to talk about jumping worms and compost facilities. We're going to try and cover some best practices for professional composters to make sure that they don't contribute to the spread of jumping worms. And we're fortunate to have a great team of experts here today to talk with you all. And very much appreciate you taking the time to join us. I'll note that today's webinar is going to be recorded and will be available on the Minnesota Composting Council website. So you're welcome to refer back to it at a later date and time. So I want to make sure to thank these organizations that you see on the screen in front of you now. These sponsors are really supportive of the Minnesota Composting Council and our mission. Their financial contribution to having this webinar today is what allows us to offer this webinar free to all of you. So thank you to Creekside Soils, FOF, SMSC Organics Recycling Facility, and Specialized Environmental Technologies, also known as the Mulch Store. These sponsors have been really supportive of promoting the compost industry and promoting best practices within it. So thank you to our 4 sponsors this morning. For those of you who maybe don't know the Minnesota Composting Council, we want to introduce you to our organization. You can see our website in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. The Minnesota Composting Council is an affiliate of the U.S. Composting Council, and we're dedicated to expanding and promoting the composting industry using principles of sound science, sustainability, and economic viability. We're focus our efforts on encouraging and guiding research to support composting, promoting best management practices like we're doing today, establishing standards so that you know if you purchase compost or mulch from a professional composter that's affiliated with us, that you are getting a good quality product. We also provide education to compost professionals and the public and work to support markets for quality compost and its use. So we would really encourage you to think about joining our organization, particularly if you are a professional composter, but also those of you engaged in yard waste collection programs, or even if you're a community gardener and are interested in good quality soil health, we hope you would think about becoming a friend of the Compost Council, which is a really nominal fee of $25 a year. So please do consider that. And we would very much enjoy having you to be part of our organization. We are today going to be offering continuing education credits to professional composters who need those credits. So those are available through the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. So to receive those credits, one of the requirements is that folks demonstrate that they took away some important knowledge from today's webinar. And as such, we are going to be having a brief quiz that will have 2 or 3 different spots in the webinar. You'll see some quiz questions. The very first question is whether you need these credits or not. Those of you who operate source-separated organic materials compost facilities are those who would need the credits. So please answer no unless you respond or unless you are affiliated with a source-separated organic material compost facility. So yard waste operators and community gardeners and others, please answer that first question no. SSOM compost operators, please feel free to answer yes. To get credits, you'll need to get at least 70% of the questions correct. Our team of experts will briefly review some of those answers with you, particularly if there's any that seem to be confusing to folks. they probably won't go through every single question. And then after the fact, our team will go through and sort of score those of you who need credits, make sure you get the 70%, and we'll follow up with you at that time. So, and everybody is welcome to take the quiz just for kind of entertainment purposes. Just again, please respond no to that first question if you don't need the credits. Wanted to also just mention during the webinar today, you'll see a chat function and a Q&A function. If you have questions for our presenters, please use the Q&A function. That'll make sure that the responses to the questions get paired with them. And so we would very much appreciate if you do that. And with that, I will kind of close my comments. You're going to be hearing from 4 different experts today. We are really lucky to have these folks. They've got a lot of expertise in composting and in invasive species. So we'll be hearing from Ryan first, who's the director of the Boulder Lake ELC and is associated with the University of Minnesota Duluth. Then we'll be hearing from 2 professional composters and from Laura Van Riper with the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. So first up is Ryan. Ryan Huffmeyer is a research, outreach, and education specialist with active projects in forest and landscape ecology and invasive species. Ryan is the director of Boulder Lake Environmental Learning Center in Duluth, which runs programs for over 6,000 people and has over 10,500 visitors annually. He works toward the transfer of scientific knowledge from evidence-based research to the public through creating accessible outreach program. Ryan has developed local projects looking for vernal pools, bird populations, invasive species, and tree survival. For the past 14 years, he has been part of the Great Lakes Worm Watch and the Jumping Worm projects. So Ryan, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and you should be able to take over.
All right, sorry about that. Here we go.
So Ryan, we were able to see your screen, but now, oh, there we go. I think we're back.
All right. All right. Tim, can you let me know if you can see my screen?
Yes, looks like we're good, Ryan. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you very much. And thank you everyone for joining this great presentation today. Today I'm gonna just kind of give us a background on Amynthus and how it compares to the other earthworms we have in the region. And then the most important thing to do with invasive species, right, is to not introduce them in the first place. And along that lines is really understanding and being able to identify them. So we're going to cover that as well, along with some best management practices. I've been part of Jump Worm project for the last 2 years, and this project has been funded through the University of Minnesota Invasive Terrestrial Plant and Pest Center and the Environment and Natural Trust Fund. As said, I've been working with worms. I can actually change it to 15 years now, and I am out at the Boulder Lake ELC, which is 20 miles north of Duluth, up in northern Minnesota, and I do a lot of work focused on citizen science, which is the work I do a lot with earthworms, and I have done the last 15 years. Today, we are gonna just get an introduction, and we're gonna cover basically 18,000 years in 10 minutes. Glaciers, ballast, and worms, and then how they impact, in particular, compost, and then we'll have some great speakers after that will go more in depth. So why earthworms? Earthworms are fascinating organisms. They do their job and they do it well. The importance for our area is there are no native earthworms in our region in Minnesota. And I do realize there may be potentially some people joining us from outside the state, but as far as Minnesota and the Great Lakes region, there are no native earthworms. And since their introduction, a lot of research has taken place, and we've found a lot of potentially negative environmental impacts. Some of the primary things that non-native earthworms do when they come into an ecosystem is they alter the soil profile and they alter the nutrient cycling. So I want to make some distinctions right off the bat. We're going to be talking about a couple different species of earthworms, and we're going to be talking about the European earthworms, and their impacts are primarily the natural forest systems, and they're found throughout the state. It's greater than 80% of all Minnesota land has earthworms in them. Jumping worm impacts are primarily right now in the research in Minnesota, is we're finding them in primarily human disturbed systems, your garden, your landscaped yard. And currently, they're really only documented in the Southeast and the Twin Cities area. I always like to start my presentations talking about just the wide variety of earthworms there are across the globe. And this giant gypsum earthworm is a fun one. Imagine an earthworm the size of a 50-cent piece and can get anywhere from 3 to 6 feet long. It's a pretty neat one. I would like to see that someday. But getting back to earthworms not being part of the system, as you can see here, about 18,000 years ago, if you take the continuous ice sheet edge, because it flowed down and it retracted and it came back down. If you took all those leading edges and you made a line, that's what that white line would be. Everything in the blue would have been covered with miles of ice. And even if there were earthworms in our region prior to the glaciers would have eradicated them from the system. There is no documentation of fossilized earthworms. So again, even if they were there, they would have been eradicated. And after the glaciers receded, there's a process called primary succession where you go from the bedrock and then the lichens start coming in, and then from there, small plants. And our forests in Minnesota and our natural systems grew without the involvement of earthworms in that system. So it was fungus and bacteria and some natural insects that broke down the organic matter and recycled it. And we made it through, and we got to these the forest we have today and had in the past, and really thick layers of organic matter, leaf litter that falls on the ground called duff that builds up year after year. And it really played an important role in the functioning, or does play an important role in the functioning of our forested systems. When earthworms came in, they did their job as we talked about. They did it really well, and they really remove that organic matter and relocate it and change it as they do their thing. Earthworms have been on the move for a long time. European earthworms, they feel were introduced through ballast. So ballast was dirt and rocks on ships when they would come. And so it was primarily port cities is where researchers think that invasive earthworms were introduced. They were brought intentionally for gardening purposes. They would have been in rootstocks of live plants that were brought over, such as lilacs or garlic mustard. The jumping worm has been documented since 1938 was the first documentation in the East. They believe that also got here through ship trade and then also horticulture. But it really has taken off in the last since about 2006, 2007, and we'll talk more about that. We'll make a distinction between human disturbed and natural systems. So as we talked about with European earthworms, they're primarily impacting these natural ecosystems or these forested ecosystems as opposed to your garden. There's a lot of research about European earthworms and their impacts in agricultural settings. And in those agricultural settings, a lot of that is true. They aerate the soil. There's a lot of compaction from the equipment, and that's going on, and they help to make the soil less dense. Their castings are just nutrient packets that these energy-intensive, food-intensive plants take up. And then there's the human disturbed systems, which are, our gardens, our landscaped areas, and those seem to be more conducive to jumping worms and the negative impacts that we're seeing, at least in Minnesota, appear to be in more of these human disturbed ecosystems. Here's a picture of me in a earthworm-free forest in northern Wisconsin. If you've ever been in a forest that is truly earthworm-free, it's a pretty neat thing to be part of. David Attenborough, they did a documentary on earthworms, but from the European perspective, and he talks about how if earthworms were part of the system, they show a graphic where the leaf litter just builds up, and it gets to the top and covers the trees. You know, that we would just, these forests would just be covered in organic matter. We know that's not true. Our forest, as we talked about, developed for 18,000 plus years without earthworms involved, and that duff layer played a very important role. And that's what I'm playing in right now. The fine roots of the plants really like that organic layer, that duff layer, and they really hold it together. And what you can do is you kind of put your fingers down until you feel the mineral soil, and you can roll that that organic layer up like carpet. It's pretty neat. It's really spongy, like those mats you would have been on in gym class in high school and middle school. So it's really cool to be able to see those spots. So earthworms, you know, is an earthworm an earthworm? An earthworm? No, they're very distinct earthworms. There are about 172 documented species in North America, and of that, about a third are non-native, and from non-native, even less are invasive. So, you know, you could have a non-native species that really isn't having any negative impacts, but an invasive species has negative environmental and economic impacts. And some of the things that, you know, the worms we're talking about today are invasive. And they come in multiple ecological groups. And so you have epigeic species of earthworms. These are small, they're heavily pigmented because they live on the surface in the fresh organic layer above the mineral soil. So they need protection from UV light, UV rays. So they are, again, heavily pigmented. And then they just feed on that fresh litter that's up on top of the surface above the mineral soil. And then you have endogeic species. These are non-pigmented. They spend most of their time burrowing anywhere from just below the mineral surface to 2 to 3 feet down into the soil. They feed on the soil and the organic matter there. They make horizontal burrows, which really allows water to spread through and get in. And they're fairly small in size. Side note, the endogeic species, the non-pigmented ones, those are typically the species you see in a parking lot after it's rained, the sun's come out and they're dead. The pigmented ones, you kind of see they're still kind of crispy a little bit, but they're able to make it typically to the edge. So it's really the unpigmented ones that you see after a rainstorm dying on the sidewalk. And then we have the anecic. So we just have one of these species in our region, and that is the nightcrawler. It makes large vertical burrows up to about 6 feet down. They come to the surface and stick their tail out of their little bin or their home, their burrow, and they grab the fresh leaf litter and they drag it down and consume it in their burrow. They are heavily pigmented as well, again, because they are coming to the surface and feeding on that fresh organic litter. And they are the largest European species we have. And then we have the last kind of hybrid species is we have these epigeic endogeic species, meaning they live and feed on that fresh leaf litter on the surface, but they also will go down into the topsoil. So they will go down anywhere from 2-3 inches to a foot or more down. And the best known of that in the European species is Lumbricus rubellus, which is the baby cousin to the nightcrawler. And as jumping worms, all jumping worm species that we have, that we know of and identify now, are all within this epigeic endogeic layer or ecological group, where they live and feed in the first few inches of that soil, which, as we'll learn, is where some of these major impacts occur. So earthworms, when they come into a system, they impact all levels of the trophic pyramid: the producers, the herbivores, the carnivores, and then the composers at each level, it affects them because it changes and removes that food quickly. So here's a diagram of a spot where this is actually the same spot where you saw the image of me rolling up the carpet in the Squamish National Forest. And if you look on the far left, you'll see this is a site that we sampled and we found no earthworms. It had a thick organic layer, a fairly thin horizon or mineral soil. And then as we moved, 100 meters towards a heavily invaded site, you can see how we started getting those epigeic species, or those species that just live and feed in that top litter. And as that organic layer starts to decline, we start to get those endogeic species, and those are the species that they feed and burrow in the soil. And then we start to get the anecic or night crawlers and rubella species coming in. And then as we get to the heavily invaded, the A horizon gets thicker, the epigeic species are gone, because that's where basically by midsummer, fall of each year, that organic layer has been consumed and it's just a mineral soil. And then at the bottom, you can see how we say, when we sampled, we went from 0 to our most biomass of earthworms sampled were in that heavily impacted area. So we kind of covered European earthworms and a little bit of the jumping worms, but kind of talked about their impacts overall, again, in that forested area and how they remove and relocate and alter the nutrient cycling. There are a few others, thanks to the global trade and some of the other things, there are a few other earthworms that we have our eyes on to see what their impacts may be, and how they may or may not establish in North America. We got the African night crawler, the Indian blue worm, the super red, but the one that we're looking at is the jumping worm. And the Amynthis species, or what we commonly call the jumping worm, is a large single species. They have large single species impacts. So when we looked at that diagram of the impacts that European earthworms had, there were multiple species in multiple ecological groups that caused the big impacts in these forested systems. Amynthis, or the jumping worm, is shown to have biggest impacts for one species. What we're learning is there's multiple species, but they all are in that one ecological group, that epigeic, endogeic group. And they are prevalent in compost as composting worms, readily available online. And a lot of times they'll be sold with the tagline, the best thing you can do for your soil. So we have 5 documented species of jumping worms in Minnesota, Wisconsin area, and they are considered the most invasive. And that's the Amynthis agrestis, Amynthis tocanensis, and Metaphyre hilgendorfi. And they all have they look slightly different in size and coloring, but again, their feeding and burrowing behaviors are identical, and it's really hard to separate them apart. And but they have, their characteristics are very different from the European earthworms, which we'll cover. So, one of the things we talked about at the beginning is one of the best things to do with an invasive species, right, is to not introduce in the first place. And awareness is a huge component of that. And that's, from here moving forward for the rest of my presentation, I'm going to be really pushing the awareness piece, and the fact of learning for your jobs and what you do as a career, learning how to identify jumping worms, and understanding ways that they can move about is extremely important in helping to slow the spread or stop the spread. So here's some examples or some images of jumping worms, and I picked some of the ones that really showcase things that I think are really important to point out with jumping worms. So they're sleek in their shape. They have more of a uniform pigmentation as opposed to just being really dark on the head. They tend to have a more uniform coloration. Their clitellum, or the ring that denotes that they're a sexually mature adult, that's usually this opal or pinkish, pearly looking ring that goes all the way around. And then a couple things I want to note outside of the Amynthus is the soil texture. You'll hear a lot about coffee ground type texture, because again, remember, all their activity happens in that top 3 to 5 inches of the soil. So they're really, really working that top 5 or 3 to 5 inches of the soil real hard. And another thing is, you see wood chips here. So they have the ability to break down lignin in wood chips, and they're able to, it's not consume the mulch directly, but through their breaking down, they make it more, it breaks it down quicker so then they can eat it. Here are some more images of gardens or landscaped areas that jumping worms have been found. And I like this picture on the left. I like this long taproot that you see, and you see very few lateral roots coming off. And these are one of the plants that, as it was pulled out, and if you look on the right here, where's Waldo, right? There's a jumping worm in that root ball. These are ones when they were removed, there were 20, 30, 40 or more jumping worms just packed around that root ball. And in some cases, we get reports of gardeners where plants are just falling over because the earthworms have consumed and loosened that soil through their feeding and burrowing behaviors around that root. More images of castings. Obviously, the bigger the casting, the bigger the earthworm, smaller the casting, smaller the earthworm. We'll talk about their life cycle in a minute, but typically in spring, you have small castings because you primarily have juvenile jumping worms. Midsummer into fall, you have larger castings because you have adult jumping worms. So this is a terrarium that was created by Joseph Gories out in Vermont. And it's just an aquarium where he had jumping worms in, and he just let them feed and burrow and do their thing for a while. And as you can see, in the top 3 to 4 inches, this is just heavily worked soil that the jumping worms have really worked. And you can see they really don't go down low. They just stay at that top surface. So Amynthus life history, they're surprisingly little known. They were identified in 58 by Gates, and but research has really taken off since 2006, and especially since about 2011. So over the last decade, we have learned a lot more, but there's still a lot to learn about impacts of jumping worms and how they interact with other earthworms and other native species. I found this to be interesting. This is in a research article called "The Second Wave of Earthworm and Earthworm Invasions in North America in Biology and Environmental Impacts." And this is a map that just shows they're primarily from the Asia region, so Japan, China, and the Korea. And if you look at the top row, you can see these are the 3 different species that we talked about that are the main species we have here. And in Japan, you can see from 30 degrees to 45 degrees. And if you look at the United States, that matches right up. So even at this tip, we have some of some species here in the northernmost section. But one thing interesting, and we'll see that when we see the map about jumping worm distribution in Minnesota, is there seems like there is a climatic gradient where we have them in the southern half of the state, but they haven't seemed to have moved north of that yet. And that kind of matches up with what we're seeing in documented distribution of jumping worms over in Asia. So jumping worms are different from European earthworms, as they have an annual life cycle. So basically in the fall, once the first good hard freeze comes, the adults die. That is different from the European earthworms, which have the ability to get down into the soil, potentially below the frost line, and you could have an adult jumping, or you could have an adult European earthworm, like a nightcrawler, live for 3 or 4 seasons, as opposed to an annual life cycle of the jumping worm, which it just lives 1 season. The cocoons, though, are freeze tolerant, and they can handle the winter, and come spring, they will hatch, and they will grow slowly they grow quickly through the summer, and then they're adults by late to midsummer, and they're then again laying cocoons again. They are asexual or parthenogenic. So it only takes one. It only takes one to start a population. Does that mean that population booms in that first year? Absolutely not. But it's the fact that it really only takes one cocoon to start a population to be relocated. So it's something to think about and something to be aware of. In ideal conditions, they've been shown to mature, meaning going from hatching out of that cocoon to becoming sexually mature or having that clitellum or that ring in just about 60 days. Compare that to the nightcrawler. The nightcrawler from cocoon or hatchling to sexually mature adult is about 130 to 150 days. So a much shorter time, but with that annual life cycle, you really need to, their life strategy is they really need to get to an adult so they can reproduce. And what research is seeing, and what the different experiments are telling us, is it's right around that 50 degrees Fahrenheit is what triggers the spring hatching, and that's soil temp, not air temp. So soil temp in that first couple inches, about 50 degrees Fahrenheit. So they reach peak abundance in the mid to late summer, so August, October, or August, September, and their populations. This is where research varies. I've seen conservative numbers that say their populations can exceed 100 per meter squared, and I've seen other research that has it up to about 300 individuals per meter squared. And to think about that, think of a 3 foot by 3 foot area, but remember they only hang out in that top inches, so it's not a 3 foot box. It's about 5 inches. So an area about 3 foot by 5 inches, you can have anywhere from 100 to 200 to some reports 300 jumping worms in that area. They have ferocious appetites, and they're large, so they consume a lot of organic matter, and that's how they can really start to cause that coffee ground type soil that really starts to alter the way that ecosystem functions. And again, there are these epogeic, endogoeic species that cause significant effects on the soil structure in that top few inches. Again, 4 images of jumping worms and their impacts, and this middle one is a interesting one. This is one where jumping worms have pretty much consumed and eaten most of the organic matter and that around this root zone. And again, as I stated before, there's been reports of plants just falling over. And so, what are their primary impacts? And again, their primary impacts is they alter the natural, the native soil structure that's there, and then the chemistry or the nutrient cycling that happens within that structure. Their preferred habitats is, again, they like these human disturbed areas, and you seem to find them in flower beds. Mulch seems to be an area that you find them in, compost piles, logs and other shady, moist areas. Anywhere there's a high volume of food for them and stays moist is areas that you will find them. Means of spread, composting is a way that they can be spread with either juveniles or the hatchlings, the adults, or the cocoons. Fishing bait is a way, horticulture and landscaping, among others. And so we're going to switch now to, going from talking to their life history to talking about the piece that I think is the most important for folks that are in the business, where this could be, where jumping worms could be an impact, or, you have the public asking you, what do you know about them? And it's definitely how to identify them. And jumping worms are very easy to identify compared to European earthworms, and it doesn't take any specialized tools or lab to do it. They typically are large, but again, the Tocadensis is a little bit smaller than the Agrestis, but they're averaging anywhere from 5 to 8 inches. They're sleek, they're darker in color than most species, but again, with all species, their colorations vary as well. Their head and tail are remarkably more streamlined. They're not kind of what they call, like with the European earthworm, kind of the beaver tail or the flat tail. They're really more streamlined. And the clitellum, or that ring, that opal ring around them that completely goes around the worm, it's really closer to the head. So a European earthworm, you're anywhere from about 25 to 33 segments back. And if you can go back to your high school or your middle school biology, when you dissected the worm, you remember worms are made up of segments, and you can count those segments. They're visible to the naked eye or a hand lens, and you can count back. And Amynthus, or jumping worms, their clitellum is anywhere from 14 to 16 segments back, so considerably closer to the head or the nose or the tip of the worm. And that is, again, something that with an adult jumping worm, you can count those segments with a hand lens. The clitellum, or the ring that denotes that they're sexually mature, again, is that milky pink, and it encircles the whole body evenly. If you've ever looked at an adult nightcrawler, for say, they have what we would call a saddle-shaped clitellum, or it flares out, and we'll have an image of that coming up. Here is some side-by-side comparisons of a nightcrawler and an Amynthus earthworm. One of the things you can see is, this clitellum is a little more circular, it's more flat, it's not as raised, and you can see the clitellum on the nightcrawler at the bottom, a little more puffy. If you look at the top jumping worm, you can see the coloration is pretty similar all the way down along the body. And with the nightcrawler, heavy pigmentation on the head, lower pigmentation as you get back to the tail. And remember, if you think about their ecological group, right, they burrow deep down, and when they're coming up, their tail stays in their burrow and they kind of reach out. So it's just what they need for pigmentation. And then if we look at clitellum, even in this image, you can count the segments: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. And then same thing with here, you count back, you get to about 32 for the nightcrawler. So again, things you can see with a good digital image and or a hand lens. What are some of the keys? The additional keys to identification is all earthworms have these little hairs called setae on each of those segments. And European earthworms have 8 hairs on each of their segments. And how those 8 bristles, or those 8 hairs, are arranged help to identify the species or the ecological group it's in. Jumping worms, all 5 of them have, all 5 of the species of jumping worms that we've identified have what's called bristle-like setae, or they have a row of hair that goes all the way around the segment. And again, on an adult with a hand lens or a good digital picture, you can see that complete row of bristle-like setae. So it's very, very distinguished, and it really helps them. They're pretty strong, and that really helps them move. Here's a cross-sectional view. So the European species, they have 8 setae, and they can be paired, closely paired, widely paired, separate. And then jumping worms, it's just one. It's just a bristle-like type setae. So jumping worms are very active. I highly recommend looking up just jumping worms, Minnesota DNR, There's some videos where you can see their movement. I'm not going to try to play the video right now, just in case my computer crashes or slows it down. But they are very active, and they move more like a snake than they do the typical worms we see. When disturbed, they will secrete a yellow mucus, and they will try to get away. And at even mild aggravation, they will drop their tail. European earthworms do not drop their tail intentionally. Jumping worms will. And, as we talked about how they move like a snake when agitated, they really got their jumping worm name because of that movement. You pick them up, put them in your hands, or you touch them and they're not expecting it, they will just thrash around. And that, again, is very unworm-like behavior. It's not the behavior of the European earthworms we've grown up with, that we've grown up with. And so that should be a cue right there. We do get a lot of reports from people of looking at European earthworms that are juvenile, so not adults. And some of the juvenile earthworms will move in that kind of herky-jerky way, but it's nothing as intense as what the jumping worms are. While all these physical traits of the jumping worm itself is important to help identify it, the first key is finding that unique soil structure. That's really gonna be your first key that, I should be looking here. When you see that granulated or coffee ground soil on that on there, and you dig down, and you can only go down a couple inches into that coffee ground structure, that should be a real trigger. I should probably check this out. And even in the absence of mature worms, cocoons can be moved. Remember, it's just not the adult worms that are being moved. It's the cocoons. They can be moved in compost and mulch and potted plants. And this is just an image of Agrestis, the biggest one on the left here. That's a cocoon. And then Ocadensis on the right, that's the smallest of them, right? I mean, these just look like the actual soil grains or soil structure they leave with their castings. So it's really difficult to pick out the cocoons from just the castings in the soil. Again, here's an example of all the castings, and again, different images of them. So we started our jumping worm project in 2020, and August 9th is the first time we had a big push for getting information out to learn more about where they are. And as you can see, on August 9th, 2020, this is what was documented in EdMaps. And this is the most on the right here is the most up-to-date map that we have in EdMaps. And so in those 2 years, through our outreach and getting people more aware of where they are, we went from 9 counties to 18 counties in Minnesota having documented positively identified jumping worm species. Does that mean they just arrived? Probably not, but more and more people are learning how to identify them and where to look for them, and that is a great thing when it comes to management and control. One of the things, and this is information from Minnesota Extension, one of the things that, when people find that they have jumping worms, the first thing to do is don't panic, right? Take precautions to avoid spreading them. Don't try to get a plow in there or something to pick it all up and move it and send it somewhere else. Don't just avoid spreading them. Try to keep them contained. Remove and destroy what you can. And what we tell local gardeners or independent gardeners are, experiment with different landscaping techniques and share your success. Spread the word and follow the research. So again, we're 2 years in, and there should be some really good research and findings coming out in the next year and a half from the work that the researchers are doing with our project. And, don't buy jumping worms. Don't move invasive species. If you're an angler, dispose of unwanted bait in the trash. If you're gardeners, be on the lookout. And vermicomposters, make sure you're able to identify the jumping worm. Icenia fetida, or true red wigglers, in our 15 plus years of documentation of earthworms across the Great Lakes, doesn't mean it hasn't happened, but we've never received a documentation of a true red wiggler or Icenia fetida outside of the compost pile. So if you're looking to vermicompost, it's the Icenia fetida or true red wigglers you want to use. Unfortunately, sometimes those worms are mixed with jumping worms, or they're contaminated with jumping worms. So again, being able to identify before you use is very important. And as far as jumping worm management efforts, the #1 management effort, don't introduce in the first place, right? Do your due diligence, see what's coming in. And I know the people that are on this presentation today, we have small independent all the way to large commercial. So how you do your due diligence, is something that really needs to be thought about. But hopefully, through today, you'll get some good ideas of what you could be doing. So there are some integrated pest management options, right? But none of them are happening now. And one of the possibilities, though, would be native flatworms. Native flatworms like to eat earthworms. So could that be something? There isn't anything that's happening in the integrated pest management side, again, that I know of, but there is possibilities. But the one thing that we do know, and work has been done, is this environmental modification, right? So one of the things that can be done is removing food sources, right? So removing that fresh organic material that they want and finding other things to do. When you're talking about compost, how do you do that? And that is something we as a group, need to figure out. But one of the things that we do know that works, right, and this works with weed seeds as well in compost, is heat. And documentation of research shows that 40 degrees Celsius, or about 105 degrees Fahrenheit, for a minimum of 3 days will render jumping worm cocoons unviable. And that's a great thing. So the typical process is that composters are using, get that up to temp for 3 to 5 days, is really, research says is working to render those cocoons unviable. The one thing is, the adults have the ability to move. So they will move outside of the heat, and then they'll work their way back in. So you really got to be looking and monitoring for that. Which leads to, what's a really good management effort for composting facilities is develop a survey and monitoring plan. It should be something that's, yes.
I just want to let you know we're just a couple minutes out here.
Perfect. I'm just about done. Thank you. And then, develop that survey and monitoring plan. And, that's something that you want to make sure, you're doing on a regular basis with the stock that's coming in, with the process that you are doing, all the way to the finished product that's ready to go out. It should be surveyed and monitored. Olmsted County, their composting facility has really kind of looked at over the last couple of years. They found jumping worms on their site, and they've really been forward moving, and really they developed this signage in conjunction with Laura that you'll talk to in a little, or you'll hear from in a little bit. And I think that this is great that they have this information for their customers as they come in and can see what's happening and give them some recommendations. Another larger organization, Bachman's is putting out management and control strategies on their website. So they're acknowledging that jumping worms is a potential issue, and what are they doing to control it. What you can do, and again, some of this it's very simple. It's just visually inspect. Look at the ground for coffee ground structure. Look at the ground. Look at worms for, moving very unworm-like. Physically inspect. You don't have to get deep into the ground. You don't need to do the mustard solution. You can do what we call flip and strip. You can just get down and start moving the first couple inches of soil. And if jumping worms are there, you're going to find them because they live in that top little bit. And then, we went through how to identify. There are other resources. We have our Jumping Worm Project website that has a lot of resources on identification. You can send images to the Jumping Worm Project, and we will help identify them for you. And all you need to do is just take a good cell phone image. You don't need to zoom in on them, just a cell phone image, and you can send that to us, and we have pretty good success in identifying them. And then each September and October, we have a bio blitz where we, across the state, try to really push, because that's when you have the greatest proportion of adult jumping worms, to really find and really start to make a fine scale of where they are across the landscape. And with that, I'll just end and say thank you and looking forward to hearing.
Thanks, Ryan. So just a friendly reminder to all of those of you listening today, please put any questions you have for Ryan or our other presenters in the Q&A. Ryan wasn't able to see those while he was talking, but we will work on getting responses to those as the presentations continue. So please do put your questions for the presenters in the Q&A if possible. I think Mary is about to post for all of us a quiz. And so once again, if you operate a source separate organics materials compost site and would like your credits, your continuing education credits, please do take that quiz. Mary, are you able to post that right now? Excellent, thank you. So we're going to leave this up for just a couple minutes, but would encourage any of you who are not SSOM sites to take the quiz. Just answer no to question number 1. But we'd like to have folks go ahead and respond to that now. There will be 2 more quizzes over the course of this morning's webinar here. So please be prepared for that as well. So yeah, if you want to go ahead and answer these 9 questions, please do so. And then in just a moment, we will turn things over. Let's see. Kayla, I might let you ask Ryan, maybe just pick 1 or 2 questions from our Q&A. I had to reset, and so I lost some of the questions. But Kayla, would you mind just picking a question for Ryan to address why folks are answering the quiz?
Sure, no problem, Tim. So maybe one quick question, Ryan. There was a question posted on the yellow mucus that you mentioned the jumping worms secrete when they're disturbed. Sean Barton is wondering if it is coelomic fluid, and apologies if I mispronounce that, as he's seen it on another species, Asenia fetida. And Ryan, if you are trying to answer that question, you are still muted. So if you could unmute.
Sorry, yes. My screen got all messed up. So yes, I'm not sure if that is what it is called, but it is very similar to the mucus you see on Eisenia fetida. When disturbed, it'll secrete it the same way that it does. So that's what I have for that. And I can go through some of these, and then you can just cut me off when you guys are ready to move forward. One of the things that, what's the difference about the forest ecosystem in Japan that makes the worms not a problem there? Jumping worms in Japan developed in conjunction with everything else as everything evolved, right? They weren't just thrown into the system and not having any natural defenses. So their populations are actually in check over there because, again, they have natural predators. The plants are able to, they're not impacted as such as they are here. So again, they've developed in conjunction with them. Are there natural predators that can be added to compost to remove jumping worms? That I do not know. And that sounds like it would be a great research question.
And I'm just going to check in with folks. Hopefully folks have kind of made it through the quiz. Mary, do you have any information on how many of our folks have been able to respond?
It looks like everybody has
Great.
the quiz from what I can tell.
Okay.
Turn
So
that off.
We will close the quiz here. Thanks all for participating. All right. And as I mentioned earlier, we will, particularly those of you who scored or who answered yes to the first question, we'll be following up with you. Mary, I thought there was going to be a report on sort of from the quiz about what questions, just so Ryan could quickly review any that were maybe confusing for folks. Do you know?
Share the results.
Yeah, maybe if you could do that real quickly. All right. Ryan, are you able to see the responses? And just
I
see if
do.
any that we want to tackle, any that looks like folks.
It looks like, we're in the 90s
Yeah, I
for all
think
of them,
folks,
so
how about the number 5 and number 9? You want to just tell us what the correct answer was to those?
well, 95% of the people got it, and it was all the above, which way they're moving around. So, humans, we do a great job of moving things intentionally and unintentionally. So it's all those ways.
All right. Well, thanks all for bearing with us on the quiz. So next up, we're going to be hearing from 2 of our folks associated with professional compost sites that are going to talk about some best practices that they employ at their sites to help ensure that they aren't contributing to the spread of jumping worms. And we'll also just provide those resources. So first up is Chuck Jowaziak. Chuck is with Specialized Environmental Technologies at the Mulch store. Chuck directs sales and market development while helping oversee operations at SET, a compost processing company with facilities around the Twin Cities. He has 26 plus years in landscape and horticultural industry and is a member of the Minnesota Landscape Association. He has worked with contractors, landscape architects, engineers, and municipal designing projects and utilized hundreds of thousands of cubic yards of compost. So Chuck, do you want to go ahead and share your screen? It looks like you are up and running. So Chuck,
there you go. Is everything good?
Looks good. Thank you. We can hear you as well.
All right, perfect. Thanks, Tim. And thanks everyone else for joining us today. Hopefully this presentation will give you at least one specific way to reduce your chances of adding to the jumping worm problem, and also maybe a few BMPs to help in the end if you are a composter, and maybe ease some minds for people that are purchasing compost products. So SET has 4 compost sites around the metro area, so we have a lot of calls about jumping worms, and I've had to learn a lot over the past couple of years here to try to answer those questions. So I don't know if this picture really depicts an actual jumping worm on the front page here, but this guy did do a pretty good job at getting up on those flowers to read about some survival techniques. So educating ourselves, as Ryan said, is going to be one of the best ways to manage organic waste streams. And this will play a really big part in slowing down the spread of jumping worms along with some of the other invasive plants and pests. And that's kind of what I'm going to touch on a little bit here today. So early messaging about the spread of jumping worms suggested that they were in compost or mulch. This brought about many calls and questions to us as composters and put kind of an immediate fear of purchasing these products on people's minds. Part of the issue stemmed from lack of understanding and clarification of what compost or mulch is and how different facilities maybe process those materials. They are definitely attracted to the types of feedstocks used to make compost, that organic matter, and the mulch. So therefore, we need a better understanding of some of the operational processes and terms maybe that composters use, especially if we say that they are in them. So hopefully this will clarify some of those things and go a long way in educating everyone. So that's really, what we're here to do today is minimize the spread and get a little better handle on this. So when choosing to compost, ask yourself 4 basic questions before beginning to take these materials to eliminate or lessen concerns and really overall liability in the end. What types of organic materials are you going to manage? Are there any potential concerns with those materials? I mean, jumping worms are what we're talking and discussing today, but what about other, potential issues like E. coli from doggy dew or herbicides and pesticides or EAB, emerald ash borer? How about noxious weeds like garlic mustard and buckthorn, or salmonella or other pathogens found in foods, biosolids, or manure? Heck, at one point here, I mean, we've gone through a really rough 2 years here, and as composters who accept food waste at one of our facilities, we're really concerned about coronavirus and could this collect on the food that people are eating, and could that be passed on to our employees or onto potential customers in the end? And we also still discuss other chemicals today that could eventually pose a problem to any of those feedstocks. So next, you have to ask yourself, will your piles sit passively and break down, or are you going to actively manage those piles? And if you are managing them, is it in an enclosed, in-vessel system or an open field? Those are things that we need to think about. Is it going to be in a windrow process, which I know Aaron will talk about a little bit more, or an ASP system, which is an aerated static pile system, which is what we use at one of our sites. And since most people want to get rid of that organic material, the bottom line is, where are you going to give it to in the end? So we avoid spreading these. I mean, each of these materials that we can collect as composters can benefit the environment if proper systems of management are put in place. However, they could also cause significant adverse effects when not managed well and sent back out for use. So one of the lowest cost ways to recover these resources is to turn those organic wastes into something good by composting them. But first, we must understand what compost is and what it is not. Notice that I called all of these materials organic waste or feedstocks and not compost. Many people to this day refer to organic matter laying in the woods, in a cart, on the street, in a bag, manure piles on a farm, pushed up in the corner of a site as compost and compost piles. To me and the U.S. Composting Council, compost is the beneficial product manufactured through the controlled aerobic biological decomposition of organic materials. The word beneficial is key to me because spreading of pathogens, weed seeds, and invasive species is not beneficial to the environment. As composters, we also try to control the outcome by taking an active role in processing material to make sure we turn it into a beneficial end product. Compost is really the product produced from controlled composting process that has undergone a mesophilic and thermophilic temperature, which significantly reduces the viability of pathogens, invasive species, and weed seeds, while stabilizing the carbon such that it is beneficial to plant growth and the environment. Therefore, compost is not just a pile of organic material sitting around for days, weeks, or years, in my opinion. That product is just decayed organic matter and should be treated as such if we are going to be spreading it back into the environment, because yes, jumping worms could be in the pile of organic material in your backyard, then move to areas that are mulched. If they got there in the compost you purchased, something probably went wrong in the system. I have processed and used and sold over 1 million yards of finished compost, and I've never found a worm in the finished material. Now, topsoil is a whole different story, and we move a lot of that product on a day-to-day basis. So I used the term active and passive composting earlier. Passive is composting is something I struggle with when it is being put back into the environment, unless it is used only for your own purposes. That way you can take on the liability of its use. It shouldn't really be sold or mixed into dirt under the term compost and then used by others if it has not gone through a process rendering it safe and beneficial, in my opinion. For instance, leaf mold, typically called compost. This is from a passive system, and it's broken down in cool conditions, mostly by fungi, similar to the breakdown of a forest floor. This is the perfect environment for jumping worms, so I have a tough time calling it compost. It is still a decent product to use, don't get me wrong, but if you're going to use it for your purpose, if you are going to use it for your own purposes only. That way you're not going to spread issues to other people. In an industrial compost process, we can set up a controlled environment which will speed up the process of organic material breakdown and also manage most of the issues we could run into as a composter. The feedstocks should first be mixed properly, then the stages of compost need to be monitored so that and frequently controlled to ensure that temperatures, humidity, oxygen levels, and all that are really in check more than anything. Well, we use an ASP system similar to the right here that you see, and that's this kind of design over here with air blowing in from the bottom to activate the piles and get that oxygen in there. Ideal composting conditions for just about any system are around about a 25-to-1 carbon to nitrogen ratio. You want about 40 to 60% moisture content and oxygen levels about 8%. If moisture gets too high, above 60% or more, or oxygen levels fall really low to below 5%, the pile can go anaerobic and really start to smell bad, and also really affect those microorganisms that are in the pile. So too much carbon can really slow down the process, as can too little of water. And then other things that we have to think about as composter are particle size, because that can also play an important role in how your system works. Now, once mixed properly, compost enters the first mesophilic stage where those microorganisms begin to reproduce, raising temps in the pile. And that's shown kind of over in this area here. And that's this first A phase here. They thrive from about 75 to 105 degrees Fahrenheit and will come back once temps cool at the start of the curing stages. This process, if you mix it properly, can take hours, or if the mix is a little bit off, it can take days. And time of season will affect that too. I mean, we are in a pretty cold part of the country here. These are just some photos of kind of that those fans used to pump air into our ASP windrows, and a temperature probe to kind of show and how we start monitoring the composting process. And you can see it here, we're about 64 degrees here at the start of the process. So the next phase that we run into is the thermophilic, or sometimes called the sanitation phase, where temps hover between 105 and 160 degrees. And those thermophilic microorganisms rapidly reproduce. Decomposition is going to happen really quickly here. And after 131 degrees, we start killing off weed seeds and pathogens. Oxygen is going to need to be replenished here the most, so it does not go anaerobic, and it should really be monitored so that temps don't get too hot, killing the beneficial organisms or start the piles on fire. As I said before, another mesophilic phase happens as materials go into a longer curing process to finish the compost and make it usable. So this is your 131 degree mark. This is the active phase of composting. And as we come through it here, we'll hit this mesophilic stage again in the curing phase as temperatures start to cool. Now, here you can see piles still producing heat in the middle of winter as a secondary turning phase, which is over here, and the curing continues until final screening and maturing phases happen. Now, one of the easiest ways to minimize your risk of spreading jumping worms is to make sure you are heat treating the materials and get them to meet what's called PFRP, and that's the process to further reduce pathogens throughout the entire pile. PFRP is a set of requirements to assure pathogen reduction. As we all know, pathogens exist and can survive and thrive in all sorts of environments, including food, soils, water, animals, and humans. While we are routinely exposed to these organisms, we want to limit exposure levels and try to keep people safe. In Minnesota, an aerated static pile system, which is what we use, PFRP is accomplished by hitting 131 degrees Fahrenheit or higher for 7 consecutive days. We accomplish this by monitoring, tracking pile and windrow temperatures at our SSOM sites, and also our yard waste only sites, which is not required right now by the MPCA. Those facilities use a turned static pile process only. Studies have shown that about 100, and as Ryan said, about 105, I think it's safe to say that 105 is more ideal. Fahrenheit will kill the cocoons and the worms, castings, and temperatures held at 85 degrees for 3 days will kill the worms as well. What's great about hitting 131 degrees is that it also kills most weed seeds and pathogens. Even hard to kill seeds like palmer, amaranth can really be eliminated by temperatures of about 140 degrees for 3 days if your moisture levels are maintained properly. And finally, while most E. coli strains will be killed at 131, there have been a few that have been found to survive up to even 160 degrees now. So we do shoot for about 170 degrees in our piles for a short period of time if possible. Now, to meet PFRP, constant monitoring and tracking of our data is needed. If properly mixed and monitored, we can produce these temperatures in the piles throughout the winter, even in Minnesota. As you can see here on a snowy 2-degree day here in Minnesota, the pile is sitting at a balmy 166 degrees. So I know where I'm going if the heat goes out. I just don't want to maybe stay too long or I might start cooking as well. But checking temperatures throughout a pile is necessary in all the locations of the pile because areas heat differently due to a lot of different factors. And I won't really get into that too much, but we track and log our temperatures until it meets PFRP. And then we regularly check to monitor since we keep piles on air for about 45 to 50 days to help break down some of the compostable products that are in there. We also monitor piles in what I call the secondary phase of composting and when curing too, just to be sure. This happens at both our SSOM facilities and each of our yard waste facilities, even though we aren't required there. I do this more or less to lessen the liability and make sure we are sending out a beneficial finished product. One other way to protect yourself against jumping worms is to set a together a set of best management practices at your site, and that'll help reduce liabilities as well. Be selective about the materials you are managing and informative about potential environmental issues to customers and staff. Have plans for materials entering your facility if known worm infestations are around your area. Things like separating incoming from outgoing materials, grinding and blending immediately if possible to get temps going, and really cleaning equipment when moving from new materials to finished products are all really good practices, and including things like cleaning boots in different areas of the sites, or some of your processing and hauling equipment as well too. Make sure you're blending and mixing materials for the proper CN ratios, water and oxygen levels, to really accelerate those temps quickly. And monitor the materials regularly for those oxygen and water levels. Make sure all the areas of the pile reach PFRP. And one big piece of protection is also to test products regularly for that extra assurance. The STA program, which is the Seal of Testing Assurance program the U.S. Composting Council has a pathogen testing process. And that's a good indicator that a product is safe for the environment. So if your tests show that pathogens are reduced to acceptable levels or not present, it is most likely that you got temperatures high enough to kill many of your possible issues. Another thing to do too is really don't let the material sit around for years without moving it. Turning will assure all areas are safe rather than just the center of the pile. And organic materials will continue to break down over time, and good or bad bacteria or weed seeds can enter those piles and grow and populate really as they do sit. So this is our Empire facility, and this is an SSOM food waste facility. And you can see here that separation of feedstocks and finished products are an important BMP. Incoming materials and feedstocks are the most likely entry points to these facilities. And hopefully fresh organics are much more inviting than overcooked stable carbon sources, so that they stay in their pile. So you can see that incoming yard waste starts over in one area, and then we grind this as quickly as we possibly can. Incoming wood waste in another area. We've got incoming food residuals in an area here. And then we've got finished compost over here. So we're trying to keep good separation between all of our piles of material. So remember, first, we need to educate the generators of potential issues on organic materials to keep them on site and manage them properly. Next, we need safeguards in place during processing to make these products beneficial for reuse. And finally, we need a better understanding of the terms to eliminate confusion so that consumers are confident in what they're purchasing or getting for free, so that these products stay out of landfills and stop producing methane gas. Are each of these, products that you see here on these 4 pictures compost? They were all found in searches for compost, and I really wouldn't use many of them without knowing a whole lot more. The first is more of a wood mulch product applied to the surface soil, which I know we didn't really touch on much, but things like jumping worms and mulch can also get tricky to understand. While they thrive on the lignin in the wood mulch products, the worms don't necessarily crawl up trees or burrow into the wood to lay their eggs. So however, grinding practices, and dragging through infested areas or piles of mulch laying around, known infestations are definitely going to attract the worms prior to use. So, you have to think about it too. These materials can be heat treated if you want, better protection. Know your product safe is the bottom line. You as composters are responsible for making the end product benefit the environment. Now, I believe Aaron is going to dive into PFRP a little bit more here and some of the turn windrow systems, and hopefully that'll answer some more questions if you've got them. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Chuck. You're right. We're going to turn things over to Aaron right away here. We're running a little behind, but so we probably won't address any questions right now verbally, but please, again, put them in the Q&A, and our panelists will do what they can to respond to as many as possible. So up next is Aaron Skelly. Aaron is the Environmental and Compliance Tech at SMSC Organics Recycling Facility in Shakopee, Minnesota. Aaron Skelly joined Shakopee Midwalker Sioux community in 2017 as the Environmental Compliance Technician for the SMSC Organics Recycling Facility. Skelly has in-depth experience monitoring all aspects of the composting process, inspecting and evaluating incoming material, and working with haulers to reduce contamination. Aaron has led the charge in implementing stricter contamination thresholds and improving overall product quality over the past several years. She also creates compost recipes, performs lab testing, and ensures outgoing products meet specifications on an ongoing basis. Skelly has completed several compost training courses and has presented on composting at local and international conferences. Skelly holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Environmental Science from Winona State University. And we can see your presentation, Aaron. You might just want to go to full screen mode. If you want to say something, I can confirm we can hear you as well.
Okay. Can you hear me? And
yes, we can hear you.
all right. There we go. Now is it in full screen?
We are in full screen. Yeah, thanks, Aaron.
Perfect. Hi, everyone. My name is Erin. I know that we're a little short on time today, so I'll just talk pretty quickly about some of the basics of meeting PFRP at a composting facility. So this is an aerial picture of our facility. We're located in Shakopee, Minnesota, and we are a large-scale composting facility that takes in food waste. We are a turned windrow facility, so we compost in these long rows of organic material called windrows. And since we take in food waste at this facility, we do have to meet PFRP in all of our windrows. So what PFRP is, I know Chuck touched on this a little bit, but it is the process to further reduce pathogens. And that is actually in the Minnesota state statutes for SSOM facilities. So that would be any facilities accepting food waste. Boiled down, PFRP is going to require that your compost is monitored. So you're tracking your temperatures over time, that your compost is going to heat up. So it needs to get over 131 degrees, and that it's going to maintain that heat for a certain amount of time. The amount of time is going to depend on what type of composting you're doing, but I will specifically talk about windrow composting. Meeting PFRP is going to make sure that any weed seeds, pathogens, or invasive species like jumping worms are going to be killed. So the PFRP requirements specifically for windrows have two main parts. One is going to be that your windrow temperatures stay above 131 degrees for 15 consecutive days. And the second part is that during those 15 days, you are turning that material every 3 to 5 days. The way that we do this at our facility is we take temperatures of our piles every working day. So weekends are excluded, but every working day we're taking temperatures with 4-foot-long temperature probes, and we take multiple readings per windrow. So we take about 6 different temperature readings in every windrow and then get an average temperature for each row and make sure that that averaged temperature is above 131 degrees. We also are turning those rows every 3 to 5 days during that 15-day period. And at our site, we use a windrow turner, but you can also do bucket turning with a front end loader or with a skid loader, just depending on the amount of material that you're dealing with. Turning is really important because this is what's going to keep your pile hot for those 15 days. You're mixing all the material up, introducing oxygen, and it really kickstarts the pile. Some troubleshooting. If your temperatures do start to dip below that 131 or near that 131 while you're doing your temperature monitoring, there's a few different things that you can do to mitigate that. The number one thing that we do is turn the pile. That really does kind of kickstart everything. You can see in the pictures on the slide, it mixes everything up, introduces that oxygen, and that really gets it going if it starts to get too cold. Another thing that we do is add water to the pile. And at our site, we do that by laying a drip line on top of the row. and then we slowly let water drip into the pile over the course of a day, and that usually helps. If one of those two things don't heat your pile back up, you probably want to look at your initial pile creation and either create larger piles, because larger piles will retain and generate more heat, or adjust your CN ratio. The lower your CN ratio is, the more heat generally your pile is going to generate. You probably don't want to go too much below 25:1 as a CN ratio, because if you go too much lower, you'll run into some odor issues. But that will help to generate some heat. And then just a note, if your temperatures do drop below that 131 degrees, your PFRP clock does reset from day one, and then you have to attempt it again. But it is important to meet PFRP. It's going to make sure that your final product is safe for sale and it's not going to be spreading invasive species. And so that is all that I have, and I will turn it over to Tim.
Yeah, thank you, Aaron and Chuck. We are going to post one more quiz here, and we're going to try and run through this one really quick. We are, of course, running just a little bit behind. So we'll just leave this one up for just a couple minutes here, but especially those of you who need those continuing education credits, please make sure to respond, and we'll just give you one moment to do so. Let's see, I'll just glance at the Q&A here and see. So we did have a question, and maybe I'll ask either Chuck or Aaron to address this, kind of related to, can you get up to 131 in these cold temps in Minnesota, particularly in northern Minnesota? So does either of you want to tackle that one?
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. If you put the proper mix ratios together, you can get up above 131 degrees without a problem. The one thing that you should understand is that, we don't always mix it right at the compost facilities too. So there have been numerous times where we've had to break down a pile and reblend it to make sure that we do get up to that 131 degrees. But most of the time we can make it work. Now, obviously, if we get to a stretch of like 3 weeks in a row of sub, 20 below weather, like we had a few years ago, that might be a different story.
Tim, we're good to end the poll. For anybody that has one quick question answered, but we get it in, so we're going to end the poll now.
All right, thank you, Mary. And if you want to go ahead, can you just quickly post the poll results? We'll see if there's anything we need to review with folks. Looks like folks got the right answer for the most part. So number 3, maybe just a couple folks were a little bit confused. Just a turned windrow composting. It is a 3 to 5 day, at least 3 to 5 turns is required. I'll just note quickly that it can be different if you're talking about in-vessel composting or the forced aeration composting. So since we are running behind, I'm going to keep things moving here and turn them over to Laura Van Riper. Our folks are willing to stay a few minutes late to answer some questions, and Laura might end up going a little bit long. We kind of shut some of her time off here, but Laura is the Terrestrial Invasive Species Program Coordinator in the Ecological and Water Resources Division at the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. Laura Van Riper has been the Terrestrial Invasive Species Program Coordinator for the Minnesota DNR Species Program since 2010. Laura works with invasive species policy, management, prevention, and outreach. Key responsibilities include improving invasive species prevention, management, and mapping, as well as coordinating and developing invasive species projects and policies with outside organizations. Laura has led the DNR's jumping worm response efforts. Before working for the DNR, Laura earned a PhD in ecology from the University of Minnesota. Her research focused on efforts of invasive yellow sweet clover at Badlands National Park in South Dakota. As a postdoctoral researcher at the U of M, Laura studied invasive garlic mustard in Minnesota forests. Laura, it looks like we can see your presentation. Might just want to go to full screen.
Yeah. Can you hear me okay?
And we can hear you, yes. So thank you, Laura.
I will go to full screen. Yeah, so my task today was to share some messages for the public. So what kind of questions might you get from the public, and what are some of those answers to those questions? So I'm going to start with some messages for professional composters and yard waste site operators. to share with the public, and then have a little bit on backyard composter information. So again, our context here is that jumping worms can be spread by either the worms themselves or their cocoons, their little egg cases. And our goal is to prevent the spread of jumping worms to new sites. So hopefully by sharing these best practices information, we can reduce the spread and protect gardens and forests. So there are a lot of key resources out there, and I put a number of links in the chat. One is the University of Minnesota Extension Jumping Worm webpage, and they do have a frequently asked questions section. If you click on that line, you get a nice accordion expansion, and a lot of your questions are there, questions that people might have. So the guidance for gardeners is to be on the lookout for jumping worms in their soil or potted landscape plants or materials they're using for mulch or compost. And that if they see soil that looks like coffee grounds or notice unusually jumpy worms, they shouldn't move that material, and they should report those jumping worms. Learning to identify worm species is really new for a lot of people. And so we want to make sure people know what species they have so that they're not misidentifying the species. So our message to gardeners is it's best to keep plant materials such as leaves and plant waste that have jumping worms on site and to not move them off site. But sometimes people feel like they do need to move them. And so there's guidance on that as well. So legally, can people move leaves and yard waste with jumping worms? Yes, they are allowed to do that. There's no regulations against that. But we do encourage people who have jumping worms on their site to keep the materials on site. But if they do want to move them, we encourage them to take them to a place that follows the process for further reducing pathogens. Worms themselves can be thrown in the trash. If someone's gardening, and as they go through their garden, they pick out the jumping worms, put them in a plastic bag, throw that bag in the trash. Yes, that is completely legal. But the law against disposing of yard waste in the trash still holds. So they couldn't just rake up all the leaves in their yard and put those in the trash can. Just the worms can be thrown. Another question is, can I send my leaves to the yard waste site? So we encourage people to find out if the place they're taking their yard waste follows the process for further reducing pathogens. Again, that PFRP, getting it hot enough to kill the worms, as well as weed seeds. Another question we get is, how do I get compost that doesn't have jumping worms? We encourage people to ask the supplier, do they follow the PFRP? Again, following that process reduces the chance of having jumping worms or their eggs in the compost. So what can yard waste facilities do at their sites? There's a lot. You can follow the PFRP. We keep talking about that one. Keeping that finished compost separate from the drop-off area. Training staff and identification of jumping worms, and then regularly inspecting finished compost for jumping worms, or really any worm species. If you're seeing worms in the finished compost, it's a sign that it's not getting hot enough to kill those out. And so these are the kind of actions that can decrease the likelihood of spreading jumping worms through the compost. So for outreach, you can make it real easy for people to find the information they're looking for. They're hearing they need to know about some of these things, make it easy for them to find it. Add a jumping worm section or a line or two on your website. Let people know if you're prepared to accept materials with jumping worms, and let people know who might be picking up the compost, the processes you take to prevent the spread of jumping worms. So you can use your website, you can have signage at the drop-off site, like here's an example from Olmsted County. And then if your city or county sends out newsletters or flyers, that's a place where you could put additional information in as well. So here's a little example website text. I won't read it word for word for you, but basically, you can put up, yes, we are following this process to kill jumping worms and their eggs. We inspect compost for earthworms. You can inspect the compost yourself before you take it home. Let people know that you understand the jumping worm issue and that you're taking steps to prevent its spread. And then feel free to link to jumping worm web pages like the University of Minnesota page or the DNR page. So then to switch to backyard composters, backyard compost is unlikely to get hot enough to kill jumping worms in their cocoons. So if someone doesn't have jumping worms in their yard, their focus is to prevent the introduction of jumping worms to the site. They likely already have some species of worms present in their yard already. No need to purchase worms. If you pile stuff up, it'll start to compost. And then if jumping worms are already present on their site, it's important that they don't move that finished compost off the site. They wouldn't want to, say, have their home compost in their urban backyard, and then that gets jumping worms in it, and then they take it to a friend's or to a cabin and move it. It's likely that there would be jumping worms in there. So vermicomposting, if you do purchase worms for composting, it's important to know how to identify the species you are buying. As we talked about, all earthworms are non-native to Minnesota. University of Minnesota Duluth did a study where they ordered a number of worm species online, and then found that a number of the orders were actually contaminated with different species than what they had purchased. So you want to make sure that if you order something, you know how to identify what you're ordering, and you know how to identify jumping worms to see if it gets contaminated. And Worm Watch has an ABCs of composting with earthworms safely brochure. That's a great resource as well. So I want to say a little bit about red wigglers. Anytime people are using common names, you don't always really know what they are referring to. Excuse me. So generally it refers to a simian species, but sometimes people are using the term really broadly, covering lots of different species. So if you are purchasing red wigglers, make sure that they say what species they're selling, and that they, that you get what you ordered and that it wasn't contaminated with jumping worms. And we are seeing some species, some companies having red wiggler mixes that are including species like Perionyx, which are very closely related to jumping worms. So make sure you notice, how to identify what you're ordering and the jumping worms, so you know you're getting what you ordered. If people are doing indoor vermicomposting, they can freeze the vermicompost for at least a week before putting it outside to kill earthworms and the cocoons. So our take-home messages for gardeners are to be on the lookout for jumping worms, and that if they see soil that looks like coffee grounds or notice unusual jumping worms in their mulch, they should look into that further. We can help identify it to help, so they know what they have and can prevent the spread. Again, don't move those materials that might have jumping worms. Report suspected jumping worms. And then our general message for invasive species prevention, is come clean, leave clean. If you're hiking, clean off your boots before you go from one place to another. If you're sharing equipment with somebody, get that mud off of it before you move it over to their site. And then take home messages for facilities. You can help prevent the spread of jumping worms. Following that PFRP at your site is really key, and communicate with the public about your actions. That is really helpful and important as well. Yes, so thank you for listening, and I'll turn it back to Tim.
Thanks, Laura. Mary, if we could go ahead and post our last quiz. We're just going to do that. Make sure those folks that are looking for their CECs can get it done. We apologize, we're a few minutes late here. As I mentioned, all of our presenters were willing to stay on a little bit longer to answer questions that maybe we didn't have time to address, but I imagine some of you have other obligations, so thank you for joining us. Let's see here, just one moment. I'm going to just once again make sure to thank our sponsors who again made sure that we could offer this webinar today free of charge. And so we very much appreciate each of these 4 organizations making this resource available to all the folks who chose to join us today. And I want to make sure you have the contact information for each of our 4 presenters in case there are some follow-up questions that we are unable to address today. And with that, I might have Mary tell me how we're doing on the quiz.
Mary needs to unmute her mic. It looks like people are still answering questions. So I think
Right.
we're just about done. It's still
All
counting
right.
up.
I do see a question about if we can get access to the presentations. And so the presentations will be posted on the Minnesota Composting Council website, or I should say a recording of the webinar will. We'll discuss with, oh,
I
go
will
ahead, Mary.
send out an email to everybody who registered either through Constant Contact or was a part of this webinar, or anybody that's contacted me during the event that was not able to sign on. Everybody will be getting a link to the recording before the end of the week, plus the other links that the presenters would like to be included in that email.
Great, thank you.
Okay. Be done with the poll.
All right, yeah, let's close the quiz and just see if there's any questions we need to revisit. Looks like people got it almost 100% right. So great job, everybody. All right, well, maybe we'll just keep going for a couple minutes to answer some of the questions. Thanks all for putting so many great questions in the Q&A and chat. We will maybe just have our, actually, if each of our presenters wants to just open the Q&A, maybe we can pick one or two of these to answer. It looks like we got to most of them over the course of the presentations. Let's see here.
Tim, I can talk a little bit about the one about most destructive to plants with shallow roots.
That'd be great, Laura.
Yeah,
Please do.
so there's one that says, since they are active in the top few inches of soil, are their activities more destructive to plants with shallow roots, or are all plants impacted by their effects on soil structure? Yeah, so this hits on one of the big research questions. It certainly seems logical, and maybe that's what we're seeing, more that plants that, have those more shallow roots, and are trying to grow in that part of the soil that gets really friable and cat litter like, have a harder time surviving. So we are interested in what people are seeing. There may be plants that are more deep rooted, might handle it better. So it's definitely an open area of study and interest.
Yeah, and I'll add one thing to that, Laura, is yes, some of your deeper rooted plants do also have surface roots that will be impacted. So yes, I believe you will see a greater impact on the shallower rooted plants, but those deep rooted plants will definitely have some impact as well.
Great. Well, I know we are a little over time, so once again, thank you all for joining us today. Thanks again to our sponsors for their support of today's webinar. If any of you are interested in joining the Compost Council, friendly reminder that we would encourage you to do that and to go to our website. If you have MinnesotaCompostingCouncil.org to learn more about our organization and or to see a recording of today's presentation. So thanks again for joining us, and please enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you all.
Mary, do you want to go ahead and stop recording?